It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker, who is Professor Marina Joubert, Associate Professor of Public Engagement with Science at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She leads the Public Engagement Lab, which is located within the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology, commonly known as CREST. Following a career of more than 20 years in science communication practice, she joined the university in 2015 to start a new teaching and research program in public communication of science. At Stellenbosch, she's responsible for an extensive education and supervision program and a diverse research portfolio. And her international research collaborations include the EU-funded Eco2Wine project and the Just Transitions for Antimicrobial Resistance, the global convening funded by the British Academy. She serves as deputy editor of the Journal of Science Communication and is an honorary lifetime member of the Global Public Communication of Science and Technology Network. Her research focuses on scientists' role in public engagement with science and the motivations and challenges that shape their interactions with society. And she's also interested in institutional science communication, representations of science in the mass media, the ethics of science communication, and online interfaces between science and society. Marina, thank you very much for joining this afternoon for what promises to be a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Bronwyn, first of all, for this wonderful introduction and this opportunity indeed. So I'm going to start by asking all of you to just, or anybody, let's just take one person for each of these. If you hear the word science communication, just what is the first thing that comes to mind? What do you think about?
Communication about your findings of your research.
Okay, so you think about communicating the findings of your research, and that already means that you think about it as something that kind of happens at the end of the research process. That's absolutely fine. What is then different when you hear the word public engagement with science, or the phrase?
For me, that's right at the onset, before the research even begins.
Okay, so there could be a timing difference between the two, one of the differences. And then maybe what if I say, how is all of this then different from social impact, which is such a buzzword that we hear a lot in universities these days?
Social impact in terms of research knowledge and dissemination of new knowledge immediately makes me think of policy implementation, sharing knowledge for best practices, for clinical practice, and so forth.
Okay, so that's, and I will immediately say that there's nothing wrong or about any of these definitions that you have given, because with terms like science communication and public engagement and social impact, and there's many other, science literacy or public understanding of science, they all have many different meanings depending on the context and the country even where you're using them. They sort of evolve and overlap, and it's maybe one of the challenges of this field that there's a lot of terminology being used, and that's not always understood the same way in different environments. But what I would love to tell you is, over the years, I've kind of developed my own working definition of science communication. And for me, it is about making science. And if I say science, I mean all disciplines, natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, even engineering, where we can. It's about making it visible, relevant, meaningful, accessible, and memorable to diverse public audiences. It is about giving information. Maybe the emphasis is quite a bit on dissemination, but communication should also be a two-way street, and there should be some element of listening and conversing, having conversations about science built into that. And if we can, yes, very often people think about dissemination of research at the end of the process, but with science communication over time, we've learned that it's really important to talk about your work with society throughout the timeline of the research, and also talk not only about the science itself, but the process, the values, the moral and ethical issues that it, the implications that it may have for society. So it means that in this process, there are many different actors involved. For me, the researchers themselves will always have a central role, but also there are journalists, there are policymakers, there's anybody in the public can participate these days in online conversations about science. So all of these people are motivated by many different objectives. They do it for different reasons. Of course, in the field of science communication, when you study it like I do, and I try to stay up to date with some wonderful scholars in the field, there's a lot of long academic definitions of what science communication really is, which I would be happy to share with anybody. People have written book chapters on the terminologies we use. But one that I really like, and it really resonates with me, is by Massimiliano Buchi and Brian Trench, two of the leading scholars in our field. And in a handbook of science communication, they simply refer to it as social conversation around science. And I really like that it's a broad and sort of inclusive definition that I think we can actually, it's also in a way, even though it's short, but it's quite rich. So one of the things, as Bronwyn mentioned, that I'm interested in is the scientists themselves as communicators, because communication is not, and if I say communication in this context, I mean public communication is not in the first place, the core role of scientists. They are there to do their research, to communicate, certainly, but within the academic environment about their work. And so I'm very interested in what motivates them to do it. And when they do get involved with society, what benefits and risks and rewards they experience, but also what challenges and barriers they experience. And there's a whole body of literature now that have done surveys of hundreds and sometimes thousands of scientists and asked them, why do you do it? Why do you get involved? And so, yes, there's an element of wanting to make my work visible for recognition, for profile, for academic impacts, because we know that scientists battle to keep up with all the results out there and all the publications. So getting your work into, say, a public platform like The Conversation can also make other peers and colleagues aware of your work and lead back to academic impacts. They want policy influence. In the end, you do your work because you want to change something or you want to make a difference. Increasingly, science communication is done because funders demand it, and you have to satisfy grant conditions. But the intrinsic rewards are always very important to most scientists, and it comes out in survey after survey. And it relates to that feeling that science can sometimes be quite lonely. So if I can get out of my office or get out of my lab and engage with societies and talk to them about my work, I also experience some meaning in that. It makes it gives me an opportunity to see how people respond, what they're interested in, what they want to know. And many scientists talk about a perception that they feel they want to give something back to society, that they even owe a moral duty to society to talk about their work, especially in a country like South Africa, characterized by inequality and people that where the science can really make a difference in their lives, and you feel that you have to make an effort to make it available and accessible to them. So one of the concerns in public communication of science is, balancing all these objectives, and there's nothing wrong with any of these objectives. Communicating for visibility, communicating to build your own profile and reputation is not inherently wrong, but there is a little bit of concern that, especially from an institutional point of view, maybe the idea that science communication can be more for reputation and reward is becoming too dominant, because institutions these days invest a lot of money in writers and designers and communication experts that actually help to package and make the research more visible to society for a variety of institutional reasons. And this is sometimes referred to as science PR. And it's just important to keep in mind that when institutions like Stellenbosch University or University of Venda, wherever you are affiliated, issue a press release about your work or achievements or breakthroughs or announcements, whatever it is, it will always be a kind of interested communication. It's done with the idea to build a favorable relationship, and it's done to make the institution look good. And therefore, it is a kind of strategic and persuasive communication. And it's never going to ask critical questions about the science. And that's why we also need other voices in science, like independent investigative journalists who can ask, the difficult questions about different research projects and the ethics and the impact on society. Also, I just want to add that I don't say that there's anything wrong with science PR, as long as it's done ethically and responsibly, and as long as the science is not hyped up and you don't create, expectations that you cannot meet, and as long as it's not cherry picking results or only showing sort of one side of the story. So there's a whole interesting debate going on about science PR versus true science dialogue with society. Of course, when we survey scientists, they also tell us many reasons why this is hard for them to get involved. And the perception that their own work is complex and that people may not be interested is often very prominent. And maybe alongside that, the time constraints, that scientists feel overwhelmed by everything they have to do. Then they tell us that they really don't have the training or the expertise sometimes that they feel they need to engage with publics. They're often very uncertain about the policies inside their own institutions. Are they allowed to just speak to the media or not? Should they get permission? Those things, especially for young scientists, are quite important. And scientists, we all know, are very concerned about what their peers will say. Will I be accused of just, seeking the limelight when I do too many media interviews, for example? Then, of course, we know that media ecosystems at the moment are evolving and changing so fast that scientists may feel very overwhelmed by competing for attention, and they may feel, that it's not worth their time. And they may also be really worried about entering into that public space where there can be anti-science and pseudoscience elements, and they may feel quite vulnerable and exposed, and they may not be able to deal with all those repercussions. So I always say it's a kind of a balancing act between the benefits and the rewards on the one hand, and then maybe the risks on the other hand. But if you are aware of these things, you can plan for it, and there are ways to manage it. Then maybe just to move on a little bit to this idea then of public engagement with science. So I would say, while I did say at the start that science communication can also be a conversation, when we do public engagement, it's much more intentional. It's much more deliberate to design to get the public input. It's not something that will happen by accident or just organically. You plan to have, conversations or focus groups or specific dialogues with specific community members that you select, and that you select for a reason. And the other big difference between public engagement for me and science communication, and that it is about mutual benefit. So in public engagement, you involve people from different backgrounds. You invite them to bring their perspectives, their ideas, their knowledge, and their values to the conversation, because you want to also learn from them. And here's one or two more sort of slightly more academic definitions. It's a type of communication that enables participation, dialogue, and mutual learning. In his book, The Engaged Scholar, a book that some of you may have come across, I think this is quite a good read on this topic, Andrew Hoffman talks about researchers as both experts and citizens, and that they want to access community-based knowledge to help them co-create new knowledge. It's a kind of process where values equity, diversity, and inclusivity. It's about dialogue. It's not about persuasion. And therefore, because you are humble and you want to listen to your audiences, it's characterized by a willingness to listen and learn. It's quite a challenge for scientists, because normally, in most cases, the scientist would see him or herself as the expert, giving knowledge or sharing knowledge with society. And here we are saying we are all on the same level. We sit around in a circle and we listen to each other. At the moment, I'm involved in a project called the Public Engagement Exchange. It's a collaboration with the Berlin Natural History Museum, and Zani, who's also in the call today, is also a PhD student on that project. And they came up with this that they call the onion of engagement. And I quite like it, because it really shows that there can be so many different ways of doing it. As you move to the outer layers of the onion, it moves more towards dissemination. It's about podcasting, newsletters, TV, festivals, lectures. And then as you move through the different layers closer to the core of the onion, you come closer to dialogue, to co-participation, to co-production of knowledge, really involving audiences. And this, for me, kind of reminds me that there's a role for all of these things. There's a place for all different approaches. And it's not a choice between the one or the other, but more and more with public engagement, we try to don't just stop at giving information, try to build in opportunities for dialogue. And that importantly, it's a continuum of activities. They often overlap, they coexist, they feed on one another. So it's not that I'm saying, you have to just do the one or the other. It really depends on what you want to achieve also, of course. And as you move along, from just giving information to dialogue to involvement, of course, there's an increasing level of involvement of the public. And you start to focus more on mutual listening and mutual benefit. Maybe this is a good time to take another quick time to hear from all of you. I said at the beginning that some of the benefits of science communication can be about raising your own profile, building your own reputation, satisfying the demands of your funders, etc. Can you think of a benefit that would be relevant for you, of specifically going that extra step of having dialogue with society? What would be a benefit of that for you specifically?
For me, it would be getting the community to actively engage government to access services such as water access. So for me, it moves beyond what I achieve to what the community can achieve by having the communication shared with the municipality, with the government, presenting it at maybe Parliament, because things such as water injustice is something that is affecting everyone. So for me, it's more than me, myself, and I. It's about what can be achieved for society as a whole.
Yeah, to add to that, I just wanted to say that for me, it's about building those relationships with the community, and giving them, so having involved them gives a sense of agency, and through that partnership will allow you re-entry into those spaces into the future, which may be necessary and important, that it's not just necessarily a once-off engagement, that this is something that's important over time.
Right.
And that doing this correctly and in a way that is respectful and so on helps to nurture those relationships.
Right, perfect. And I see Anya has added as well, just generally greater impact of the work. And certainly it is an important aspect as well. But of course, I think it resonates with everything you've said, but engagement presupposes that public views can enrich the research and that public input can generate new ideas and open up new research questions. In many surveys, scientists express amazement that they were skeptical at first, but when they actually started getting involved in public engagement, they were actually amazed by the rich input they got from communities and from lay audiences. So it also helps you to reflect on what people want to know and what concerns they have. And if you can anticipate those concerns, it becomes so much better to be pre-warned and to design your research accordingly. Of course, it demonstrates social responsiveness. It builds those relationships and trust that you mentioned, Bronwyn. And then again, maybe surprisingly to some or unexpectedly, researchers do find it incredibly rewarding and enjoyable if they are skeptical at first, but once they overcome that skepticism, they usually say that, once you do it, you really see the value and you actually enjoy it and you want to do more of that. So I think you all, in this space of being in the field of psychology, you're much closer to this field than sometimes if I was speaking to biologists or environmental scientists or, engineers, but you also understand the importance of listening to people, giving everyone a voice, creating a safe space where people can have a conversation, where no one is judged, even if they come with anti-science views, they won't be ridiculed, they won't be judged, no one will dominate. And once again, this demands of the scientist to be one of the group and not to be the expert in the group. Also, to do engagement in a way that is sensitive to cultural differences and that values different knowledge systems and also tolerate different views. Never to be defensive, never to be confrontational, to be patient and respectful, that was also mentioned. And then to acknowledge your participants when you do produce research outputs and not to forget them, to make sure that somehow the results of a project, even the results of a dialogue, feeds back to that project. And so this is why it's sometimes hard for scientists, to make this culture change in their heads if they've never done this before, if they're much more used to the one-way communication of science or dissemination of research. Also, being successful at engagement demands that you're honest and transparent about why you do it. So if you engage with the community, to explain to them why it's necessary, why it's being done, what are you going to do with the input, how is it funded, to manage their expectations. Very often, I'm sure any of you who have engaged with communities know that people come to a discussion and they may expect payment, they may expect some benefits that you may not be able to deliver. So you have to be really upfront about that. You have to move away from providing lots of facts and explanations and focus on the dialogue. And that also means limiting the amount of information you try to convey and using plain language and clear examples, letting go of the jargon, be willing to experience or to experiment rather with personal stories and connecting with people on an emotional level. And what I always say to scientists, if you feel that this is way outside your comfort zone, get help from an experienced facilitator with engaging with communities. It's not easy to do, and that's also why it's necessary to plan for engagement from the start if you want to take it seriously and budget for it so that you can get help. So if we think about the shift, and as I said, it is a continuum. It's not that we draw a sharp line between it, but if you think broadly about dissemination of knowledge on the one hand versus dialogue and engagement on the other hand, I would love to hear from you, from one or two of you, about why do you think it is so hard? We've been talking about engagement for a long time, and there's this perception now that despite talking about it a lot in academic papers and in policy papers, the one-way dissemination of information is still the dominant way, and very few scientists actually seriously move on from outreach to true engagement. And why do you think that is?
I think to a big extent it's the status quo and people not moving away from this is how my professors did it, my supervisors did it. So it's just a continuation.
Right. Definitely that whole entrenched mode of, this is how we disseminate our findings, this is how we make it available. That's very, very, very definitely true. Anybody else? Why do you think that this one-way communication seems to persist and seem to dominate still?
So I think, it's multifaceted answer. We already heard a good answer, but as scientists and researchers, we are the experts in a specific field and used to being in control of the information. So kind of that dialogue is letting go of that expert hat and also like sharing that hat of expertise. So that's sometimes difficult. But on the other hand, I think it's also like maybe like just how the training and showing and the building capacity. I think it's easier said than done. As you said, there's a lot of research published. We know we should do it, but I don't think it's like the know how to proceed to do effective and ethical engagement.
Right. You've touched on a number of very, very important things. And I think the one core thing that you said is it's easier said than done. It's very easy to talk about engagement and to discuss how amazing it can be and how it can enrich your research. But if you start thinking about the practicalities of planning for it, selecting the communities and the individuals you want to engage with, getting them there, getting them interested. We can't assume that people necessarily want to have a dialogue with us and will make time for it. There's a lot of practicalities, physical spaces, language barriers. Do you have to provide catering, a venue? It has to happen over time. I think, Bronwyn, you mentioned that it's not just a once-off thing if you want to do a really meaningful engagement. There are so many practical issues alongside the idea that, this is not how we used to do it before. So there's a lot of practical barriers in the way that can make engagement really hard. But I would say at the same time, that means if you do it, it can be very, very, very different from just the one-way science communication and so much more rewarding. So what I've got here on this side is capturing just a few of the ideas of why it is so hard to move from that deficit approach to the dialogue approach. We said that the scientist to public approach is firmly entrenched. Scientists, when you ask them, why do you want to engage with the public? They very often talk about educating the public or correcting misinformation. They feel a duty to get rid of all the perceptions out there that are incorrect, and they think if I can only provide them with the academic knowledge, people will agree with me and all the misinformation will go away. And sometimes they think it's less important to gain public input. It's more important to educate the public. Then there is a real challenge that engagement can sometimes just become a tick box exercise, because we have a funder now that asks for engagement, and I'm going to do a few dialogues with society, but I'm not really doing it for the right reasons. It's not really authentic. So that's a real danger. Len, let's be honest, if you are in a university, it's sometimes much easier to get help for one-way dissemination, to get help from your media office to do a press release. If you have a important paper coming up, there's all kind of support structures you can call on to help you. That kind of support and help for public engagement is rarely available. And we talked about, letting go of authority and control. So basically, it all comes down to this idea that engagement is easier said than done. You have to think about time, skills, the scaling of it, ethics, risks, roles, expectations. What do you do with the input? How do you give feedback to the participants? And I'm sure the list can even be much longer. And then once again, as I said, I just want to emphasize that again, that we have to keep in mind when we talk about this is that the engagement can be a logical extension of the one-way communication. If you just think about it creatively, it can result sometimes from dissemination. It doesn't have to be something completely on its own. So the whole, sometimes in the literature that I look at, science, communication, and engagement, they talk about the engagement turn, this idea that at some stage scientists became increasingly aware of the fact that just giving people information is no longer enough. It's no longer effective. We have to do something different. This was around the early 2000s. And since then, people increasingly started talking about the value and the need for dialogue and public input into research. Can anybody in the room here tell me why? Why do you think this happened? Why was there this big awareness? We have to engage the public. We can no longer just tell them what we're doing. We have to listen to them as well. Why do you think that happened broadly? I mean, just there's no right or wrong answer. Why do you think that happened?
I think part of it is the technology and access to information that has broadened so much that to kind of keep that responsible is becoming increasingly difficult, but also important, so that people have access to the right information, because they have access to everything.
They have access to everything. There's a lot of incorrect information out there that is disseminated with different objectives in mind. And what you say is also true, because suddenly everybody can participate now, where they were not able to maybe participate before through various social media channels.
Prof, I'm thinking about the philosophy of science and how those conversations are evolving and influencing the practice and the practice of science and dissemination of scientific results and findings. For example, if we consider social constructionist philosophies and epistemologies, which highlights that knowledge is co-constructed in social relations, and that is different from the modernist approach to knowledge and knowledge dissemination in a more linear manner. Right. So I think perhaps from an epistemological, scientific, epistemological research philosophy perspective, that could perhaps also influence that turn.
Right. It's fantastic input, and it's such an amazing audience today. Knows more about these things than very often when I speak to scientists in other disciplines. So along with the engagement turn, I mean, I don't want to go too much into a lot of history now, but there was a lot of people have studied the effects of big environmental disasters, could be like Fukushima or Long Mile Island, or several other things that happened, like the mad cow disease crisis in the UK. And I see, Bronwyn, you've mentioned COVID, that's obviously more recent, and have mentioned how these big crises, public crises, have eroded public trust in science to some extent, have caused people to become more skeptical or maybe even turn anti-science. And what happened at the same time is this awareness that without public support, science really has a problem. Science has to be legitimized through public input to some extent, because, especially in democratic societies, science is dependent on public support in the end. And so what happened at the same time, and very often people from social psychology and from behavioral sciences started looking at how does it work when we give people information about science? How do they form opinions? How do they decide how to respond? And a field that is now known as the science of communicating science, or the science of science communication, started evolving. And one of the colleagues that I know quite well in this field, Craig Cormick, is an Australian. He wrote this lovely little guide. It's a very short and sweet little handbook about the science of communicating science. And in this handbook, he has this illustration where he says, you know, we think, or many scientists think, maybe not people with a training in psychology, but many scientists think that if you provide information to someone, they're going to listen to you, they're going to hear what you say, and they're going to form an opinion or get the idea, generally what you intended it to be. Now, I think you all in the room today know, well, that it doesn't work like this. Before I show you his next illustration of how it really works in the real world, what do you think? How does it actually work in your experience? From information to the head of the audience, you know, to the mind of the audience that you're talking to. What happens along the way? So basically, the next slide shows how Craig tries to explain that if we give people information, they filter it through various filters, their own value system, their confirmation biases, you know, their own motivated reasoning. There's some heuristics or mental shortcuts involved. So by the time the information comes into their head, they will form very different opinions or ideas based on what was already in their head before they started listening to you. So this actually means then that giving, say, 100 people the same talk about something like vaccines, for example, will not have the same effect in all 100 of them. People will form their opinions based on their prior experiences and worldviews and many other things. And this is complex. It's really to do with behavioral science and psychology and how opinions are formed. And probably some of you are much more, you know, familiar with all these things that I am. But some of the basic takeaways from the science of science communication is that we know it's important to give people information and it's important to try and generate knowledge, but knowing more about something does not mean I'm going to support it. There's not a linear correlation between understanding something and supporting it. In fact, if I know more about a topic, I may actually become more concerned about it. So what I always say to scientists is, I'm not saying that you shouldn't provide information. I'm not saying that it's not important to give people facts, but it is dangerous to assume that they're going to just trust everything you say and accept everything you say. You have to understand that people will process the information you give them in line with their pre-existing views. And therefore, the effect of your information may not necessarily be what you had hoped for. There's a wonderful article that published quite recently in a journal called Biological Conservation, and the article is about why facts don't necessarily change minds. And even though this article is written for conservation scientists, I really do think that it applies broadly to almost all disciplines of science. And it's a really interesting article to read. And basically, they talk about this idea that we think that people are rational beings and that they will base their decisions on information, but actually people respond according to how they feel. They respond on an emotional level. And therefore, if you challenge people's preconceived notions or beliefs, your facts may actually backfire. But we know also from a whole body of research by now that one of the ways to overcome some of these barriers is to have an emotional connection with your audience. To have storytelling is one example. There are others as well, where you can overcome some of the barriers and actually foster positive behavior change or positive action in your audience. So there's actually another article written a bit longer ago, but one that I also really go back to often and read again and again is The Science of What Makes People Care. And there they also talk about the importance of emotional connections, telling better stories, using images. So moving away a little bit from the cold and objective kind of communication that we are trained to do as scientists in our academic journals, and moving on to connecting with audiences, speaking to them in a way that resonates with them. So this actually reminded me of, in my early years of joining Stellenbosch University, one of my colleagues was Professor Jan Botha, and he did a wonderful talk to all of us at that stage, your PhD as a persuasive act. And he because Jan is was a scholar of theology originally, he spoke about the Greek, ancient scholar Aristotle and the three pillars of rhetoric, how you build an argument. And in his talk, he talked about, the three pillars, the logos, the ethos, and the pathos, where the logos is the appeal to the rationality, to the facts. Here's the facts. Surely you've got to trust them. But the ethos is about the credibility of the person presenting the facts. And then importantly, the pathos, appealing to the emotions. And I found it quite fascinating when I think about it that today we have this whole new field, the science of science communication, but it actually comes back to this ancient Greek wisdom that it's a three-legged stool if you want to communicate with people. And we all know that having just two of the legs is never going to work. So if you have only emotion and credibility, but you don't have any content, any facts, it's not going to work. No two of the three will ever work. You do really need all three for effective public engagement, effective public communication. And it kind of, for me, the takeaway from all of that is, you do need the facts. You do need sometimes to give people information first, but you've got to try and make an emotional connection with them as well by putting yourself into the story. We can talk a lot about, how do you achieve those emotional connections. I want to quickly share one other resource with you that you might want to look at is Professor she's not a professor. She's a documentary filmmaker. She's a science communication practitioner. Sonia Pemberton spoke at a conference that I attended about 2 years ago. And she spoke about how she makes her documentary films by using science and mostly by using insights from behavioral psychology. And when we walked out of the talk, I spoke to her afterwards. I got hold of a copy of her notes and I worked with her to publish her 5 golden rules for effective science communication as a piece on the conversation, which you can easily access. But the 5 golden rules that she spoke about in her talk is basically the value, the importance of acknowledging uncertainty, because that also helps the audience to see you as a human being that's fallible and don't pretend to have all the answers. The importance of avoiding polarizing messages, of finding common ground, checking for biases, especially your own, inciting curiosity as, once again, that's an emotional connection if you can incite curiosity, but at the same time to not shy away from embracing complexity. And you can read more about how she explains all of those in that conversation talk. Because the topic of the day was, how do I optimize the benefits and mitigate the risks? I thought I'd just conclude by saying that science communication and engagement is in the end a balancing act. But I believe if you approach it and carefully and if you plan it strategically, you can definitely, the rewards will outweigh the risks. And this has also been proven, by a lot of scientists who have experienced this and who have explained how they were able to do this. And the last slide, second last, I just wanted to tell you this Journal of Science Communication is one of the journals in my field. I'm actually involved as a deputy editor of this journal. And recently there was a lovely essay or an article reflecting on why it's so difficult to move from a one-way street to true dialogue that you may want to have a look at. And then the very last slide I wanted to share with you is the Public Engagement Exchange that I talked about. They produced this Principles of Public Engagement guide, the Berlin Natural History Museum, and they also produced a guide on emotions and engagement and what it means. And both of those resources are available at that link.
Marina, thank you so much for an incredible talk. And I would just like to, on behalf of everybody, just give you a round of applause. It was so helpful and interesting, and all of the resources that you shared. I'll definitely be returning to this talk to follow up on some of those. And yes, I definitely want to open the floor to conversation, but just wanted to give a little bit of context to the link that I posted in the chat, which is a piece that was published in June 2003. It's a guest essay opinion in the New York Times, which was titled "My Body is a Clock: So the Private Life of Chronic Care," and it was written by Sarah Winston, who is who's a photographer, really. And she used this guest essay to communicate her life of living with multiple sclerosis. And in the field of mental health in particular, which is a field that I work in, we're increasingly encouraged to, but many of us have for a long time, been working with and alongside those with lived experience of various conditions, to guide our research and to inform what we do, and to think, to help us think through analysis, to help us think through how we disseminate and how we tailor that dissemination to be appropriate for the various audiences. And in my case, a lot of the time, this is young people with mental health conditions. But then having read this piece from someone with a lived experience through their lens was also incredibly eye-opening into, those personal experiences. And I found myself learning a lot more about the condition in this way than I would if I, went to go read up about multiple sclerosis. And I've had students who've done their thesis on multiple sclerosis. The lived experience of fatigue in particular was one, but this stood out. And I posted this link because when you spoke about the connection with personal stories and how you communicate that, this was one of those pieces for me that resonated as, and this is then, how someone with a lived experience would communicate it. And often what we try to do as scientists is, especially when you're doing something like narrative qualitative research, which is where you are, recounting the stories of those with the lived experience, but always asking yourself who's telling the story and how is it being told and what is being communicated, and being so mindful, of how you do that. And it just makes you realize that you really have to do this in a way that is sensitive and responsive. And this was one of those pieces for me. So thanks so much for that talk. So Marina, thank you once again very much for your time, and colleagues for your attendance.
Thank you so much, everybody, for the feedback. I really enjoyed this hour with you as well, and for the opportunity. Thank you, Bronwyn.